Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I am the chief economist at American Compass, and we have yet another very special episode for you today. At this point, we're going to have to just warn you if the episode is not very special. But this was a lot of fun. I had the opportunity to head out to San Francisco for the American Economic Association's annual conference, where Jason Furman of Harvard University invited me to speak on a panel on economic policy in the Trump administration alongside Kimberly Clausing from the University of California and Richard Burkhauser from the University of Texas. It was a fascinating discussion because you had, Rich had served in the Council of Economic Advisors in the first Trump administration, but had places he tends to be very supportive of Trump policy, places where he was less so. You obviously had me representing the American Compass point of view and a lot of the things that I think are probably key Trump priorities in a Trump administration this time around. And then Kim, who tends to be a much more conventional right-of-center thinker on things like trade policy, very skeptical of tariffs, very enthusiastic about open immigration and so forth. And so really enjoyed the conversation. It was a long panel, about 2 hours long, and so we've actually split it in half. You will get part one now, and then we will head into part two in a separate episode. But really appreciate all of them allowing us to bring this to you as a podcast. Of course, have to tell you about what else is going on at American Compass. On the Commons, our managing editor, Drew Holden, has a really interesting piece on Trump's anti-bureaucratic instincts called It Can't Just Be Doge, and especially important, Commonplace now just a week away. So mark your calendars, set your alarms, send yourself email reminders. Commonplace.org coming to you next week, and we have just a ton of really great content lined up. So you will be hearing a lot from us about that. Finally, of course, Understanding America had what I humbly think was a definitive take on the H-1B blow-up and whatever on earth it was Vivek was tweeting about over the holidays. So if you haven't, head on over and give that a read. And of course, then subscribe. It's at understandingamerica.co. But here is part one of the discussion on economic policy in the Trump administration.
Well, welcome to this panel where you're going to learn exactly what the Trump administration is going to do over the next 4 years and the consequences of all of that. And we are joined by three terrific people with, I think it would be fair to say, diverse perspectives on a lot of the topics that we'll be going over today. First is Richard Burkhauser, who is a professor at UT Austin. He's emeritus from Cornell and served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump. Oren Cass is the founder and chief economist of American Compass and has an Understanding America Substack twice a week. And finally, Kimberly Clausing is a professor, I think, oddly enough, of law at UCLA, a fantastic economist, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and was the deputy assistant secretary for tax analysis or policy analysis at the Treasury. So we're going to start with just a broad question about the role that economic analysis played in the first Trump administration, might play in the second Trump administration, whether that's good or that's bad. And then we're going to go through a number of the different topics and then open it up to your questions. But for now, Oren was brave enough to come here. He recently wrote an op-ed taking on the entire economics profession. And on 4 days' notice, he agreed to show up in a room of rabid, scary people and brave all of it. So, Oren, why don't you, because by the way, the people in this room also only read the FT. That's where they get their entire worldview from. So they may not have read your excellent New York Times piece on what economists have to learn about George Costanza. So maybe share that general argument. But if you could do 2 sentences on what American Compass is and what role it plays in all of this, I think that would be of interest to people too.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I delight in spending time in rooms like this. In my experience, economists aren't especially scary. And I think it's a fascinating time in the profession. And my hope is that it comes out the other end stronger though I have my concerns, which I will speak about in a moment. American Compass is a group founded in 2020, so coming up on our 5th year anniversary. We get called a think tank because we gave up on thinking anything else to call ourselves. But effectively, we do a lot of the work pushing the thinking on the right of center about what should come in economic policy and thinking after the market fundamentalism that has been the orthodoxy for the past 30 or so years. And so, that obviously covers a whole wide range of subjects, from trade and immigration policy, industrial policy, competition policy, financial market regulation, labor policy. We were probably the first group pushing conservatives to take seriously engagement with organized labor. Family policy, we've sort of put out the main proposal that a lot of Republicans are advancing versions of, to create a more generous family benefit. Education reform that focuses much more on non-college pathways, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you can probably guess the set of folks in Congress who we tended to work with most often: J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton. Obviously, some of those are moving on to fairly influential positions in the administration. And so, we are at a point right now where we are very eager to see what does and does not happen. I think the big H-1B debate over the past week or so underscores what we were just hearing about in terms of the many tensions still within the Trump coalition. But I think certainly one cause for hope from my perspective is that if you do compare things to 2016, what you see is almost across the board the actual existence now of a set of leaders, of a coherent way of thinking, of a policy agenda that can be carried forward. And so I'm hoping certainly that some of that happens. With respect to economists and economics, which is obviously central to all of these debates, the key dynamic that I think is at play, certainly on the right of center, but probably to a significant extent on the left of center as well, is a great level of concern or awareness that economists have not done a very good job over the past 25 years of advising policymakers. The absolute confidence and unanimity and downright condescension with which economists lectured to the rest of the country that we must embrace free trade with China in 2000, the attitude toward financial markets that led to the financial market crisis and ensuing very long recession, the deindustrialization of wide swaths of the country, the slowing growth, the failure of repeated rounds of tax cuts to deliver anything that certainly Republican economists were promising that they would, all of which has led to a situation where I think people rightly look at what economists are recommending and say, why on earth should we expect that to be true? The tariff debate is probably the best example of this, where in making the case that, of course, we can't impose tariffs, we must not disengage from China, the arguments all work from the exact same set of assumptions and models that made the case for embracing China. And so, yes, of course, if you think that embracing China was a good idea and went well, you would not now suggest disengaging from China. But if you think that was a failure, then there's not even much of a conversation to be had with people who are saying, no, but my models that say it was a good thing to do say we shouldn't do anything else. Because that is, of course, what the models say, and they are not good models. And so, this brought to mind for me the classic Seinfeld episode in which George Costanza wanders into the restaurant and says to Jerry he realizes that every instinct he's ever had, every decision he's ever made has been exactly wrong and brought him to this moment in life. And Jerry says, well, if every decision instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite must be right. And of course, George then tries just doing the opposite and his life immediately takes off. I wouldn't suggest that we simply assume that doing the opposite of everything will work where something has not, but I think the fundamental underlying point here is that if what you have been doing is not working, you cannot retain credibility and expect good outcomes by simply continuing to do it. And so I think we're at a moment where there's a tremendous amount of very interesting and important rethinking going on among policymakers about how to handle the set of challenges we actually have in the 2020s, to which the recommendations of late 1990s neoliberal economics are not responsive. And to the extent that economists respond with, no, you don't understand, let me read to you again from my 1990s model, it's just not going to be all that influential. And so that gives me a great deal of hope that we are in fact moving toward better public policy that takes much more seriously the drivers of growth and prosperity within the United States. But I think there's no question it's a challenge for the economics profession. To what extent is there going to be a reckoning and an openness to rethinking, and as a result, being able to provide that advice that actually makes these policies work well, versus to what extent is there simply going to be a sort of covering of the ears and telling everyone that they don't understand, sort of off in the corner where it becomes less and less relevant to what actually goes on in our political system.
Great. We're going to come back and really dive into trade as our first topic, but want to hear from Kim. I think one thing that strikes me is everyone always thinks it's somebody else in charge of everything. So, Oren, you talk about how economists were dominating everything. Every room in economists I was in were like complaining that no one was listening to us, and everyone liked protectionism, and it was somebody else in the other room making all the decisions. And I guess that's what I'd want to hear from you, Kim. You wrote a terrific book called Open. It was completely persuasive to me. Everyone in this room agrees with your book. No one outside this room agrees with your book, as evidenced by the last election. Tell me, why that is. Should you be doing some of the rethinking Oren is saying? Do you think that message did or didn't get through? So this is a combination economics, politics, your thoughts on openness, and all that, how that relates to the Trump administration.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks for organizing this conversation. I'm happy to be here to have it. So maybe to answer your question, it's helpful if I first talk about the book and then circle back to the role of economists. But I think when I look back at the 30 years I've had as an economist so far, I think the thing I might be most proud of is that book. And I think the reason is it engages a really important set of policy issues, in my view, using the strengths of economists to understand those issues better, but also maybe overcoming one weakness of economists in the sense that I don't know that the typical economist is always great at explaining in a persuasive, logical, and compelling manner, some of what economics does do well. So that's what I at least attempted to do with that book. So the argument of the book is that there are some very real problems facing Americans. And I think when I look at some of the work that Oren's done, I agree with some of the characterizations of these problems. So for instance, if we look over the past 4 decades, we see that in some parts of those 4 decades, not every year, but in many of them, income inequality was increasing and wage growth was somewhat disappointing. And some of the correlated outcomes around health and education and people's material sense of well-beings were also fell short of what we might have wanted. I think some workers felt left behind. I think some communities felt left behind. And my book begins with like an open recognition that that's problematic, that our economy hasn't always delivered as much as it could have. But then it really asks 2 questions. One is, can we lay at the feet of globalization that problem? Do we think globalization, free trade, immigration, global capital is responsible for the harms? And then the second question, which I think is an even more important one, is regardless of what caused those harms, would trade restrictions and immigration barriers help with those who've been left behind? And if the answer to that is no, what would help them, right? And so that's kind of what the book sets out to do. And the answer to the first question, is this all the harm caused by globalization, I put as a cautious no. I think that there are many other factors that are responsible. That doesn't mean globalization didn't have a contributing role in some contexts, and for some workers it certainly did. But, it's overdetermined. Technological change, market power, declining unionization, changes in social norms are just a small subset of other things that we might also use to characterize those 4 decades, as well as, big policy changes in tax and regulation. So I don't think the economic research, which has been very careful, has really backed the idea that globalization is responsible. And in fact, if you look at kind of the most famous study, the Otter work on the China shock, they calculate that the opening to trade with China may cost us 2 or 3 million manufacturing jobs at the upper level over a period of a decade. And that's a concern, but it also created a similar number of manufacturing jobs in other sectors. And we should remember the U.S. economy destroys about 6 to 8 million jobs every quarter. And it also creates about 6 to 8 million jobs every quarter. We live in an incredibly dynamic entrepreneurial economy, right? And so there's going to be some harm and dislocation associated with all of that. And as long as we have capitalism, I think that's what we can expect, and frankly, any other system too. So then the second question, which I think is a more important one, is would trade restrictions or immigration barriers help the typical worker who feels left behind? And here I think the resounding answer of very careful economic research and facts that go well beyond the 1990s to the present day is that trade restrictions would actually hurt the very same people that you're intending to help with them. In some work that I've done with a colleague, we calculate that the Trump tariff proposals, as one example, would cost the median American household, just in higher import prices, about $2,000 to $2,500 of tax increase. And that doesn't even account for the harms associated with higher domestic good prices or with retaliation and the shrinkage of economic growth. Now, you could say, well, Kim, that's just consumption. What's more important is production. And that argument has been made often, including by my co-panelist here. But when you look again at the research, and there's been some really good, really careful research done, in fact, by some of the people in this room, you find that the production side of the economy is also hurt by tariffs. And in fact, we just ran a nice experiment in the first Trump administration where we raised tariffs, and you saw that the communities that were most affected by these tariffs saw almost no increase in job growth in the protected industries, but jobs were hurt in both export industries that suffered from retaliation and in manufacturing as a whole, because the supply chain is very reliant on imports, right? If you look at U.S. imports, over half of them are intermediate goods, right? So if you're making intermediate goods more expensive, you're making producing in America less competitive to producing somewhere else. So basically, you're adding insult to injury to whatever shocks workers have received if you're also creating new shocks through tariffs. And that's the argument that I make in the book. And I think it's even more persuasive with respect to immigration, where I think deportations, as one example, would cause tremendous negative economic shock. And hopefully we'll get into that in a minute. This doesn't mean that there aren't policy solutions that can address discontent. And I suggest several of them in the closing chapters of the book. I think a more progressive tax system is an excellent response to any source of economic disruption, because you're asking a little more from those at the top to help out those who've been left behind. I think investments in infrastructure and human capital, as we've learned from decades of economic research, can be quite productive as well. So circling back to what economists do well and what they do poorly, I would say that debate that I sort of go through in the book is very well informed by decades of very careful economic research that was scrupulous about identification, was data-based, was sometimes, theoretically based as well, theoretically informed, but really took the theory to the data in a rigorous way. And I think the fact that so many economists agree that tariffs are a very distortionary tax isn't because we're in some sort of cabal where we've all decided that we have to state an ideology. It's because the research is incredibly compelling in that area. We don't all agree on the optimal capital gains tax rate. I would say there's quite a bit of divergence there. And that's partly because the research in that area is less uniform in its assessment. So I think economists have done a great job at pushing forward research and understanding these pressing issues in front of us. I think the one thing that I would hope economists could do more of is thinking a little bit about how to communicate their sets of findings in a way that is compelling and meaningful to typical people, right? I think that the research agenda of economists, as you could tell from the program of this conference, is covers all sorts of issues that are directly touch people's lives, from everything from the child tax credit to education. You know, the list of concerns that Oren so legitimately has. But I think sometimes we kind of write our beautiful papers and we stick them in beautiful journals, but we don't stop to sort of think about, like, how can we best communicate what the field is learning as a whole to the world as a whole. And I think one of the things that's difficult about this moment is, even though we have excellent journalists and excellent interlocutors who are willing to have these conversations, it sometimes feels like the country is having two separate conversations. And there isn't enough overlap like we have on this panel. So the chance of us coming to, you know, a more uniform view or sharing ideas in an open-hearted and open-minded way is smaller than it used to be. And I think that's a real challenge for all of us.
Great. So let's dive in on trade. And I want to start with trade, not with China, because China raises its own set of issues. So trade with the rest of the world. And in this, President Trump, you hear two types of things. One is trade restrictions as a negotiating tool. They're not good in and of themselves, but we'll get something in exchange for them, whether it is Mexico stopping fentanyl over the border, Canada stopping being Canada, or something else. And then there's a second thing, which is that tariffs are good in and of themselves. This is something you would hear Lighthizer, who's not going into the administration, articulate as a way of reducing trade deficits. Or they're an efficient way of financing the government because the incidence, it is argued, falls on others rather than on Americans. Oren, I'd like to hear from you which of these two general sets of theories you think the administration is going to be guided by. Tariffs as a negotiating tool, or tariffs as good in and of themselves. And you have argued a bunch of tariffs in good in and of themselves. I want to hear the specifics. What do you think is good about tariffs?
Well, what do I think is good about tariffs is they place a finger on the scale in favor of domestic production over imports. They are the sort of thing that you draw on a blackboard in Econ 101 if you want, and the Econ 101 lecturer says, as you can see, this is bad because it creates
this class, by the way.
Because it creates an inefficiency and a distortion, and this triangle is the deadweight loss. But of course, that's only true if the market, without that distortion in place, is the efficient one and at the right equilibrium. If it is not, then in fact the tariff can eliminate deadweight loss and lead to a better outcome. And so I think when you look at the U.S. position in the global economy over the past, again, 20 to 30 years, the explosion of the trade deficit up to more than $1 trillion a year, which again is something that economists predicted would not and in fact could not happen. Trade deficits are self-correcting, in Paul Krugman's term, is a huge problem. The several million manufacturing jobs are not the same thing as the churn over time in which jobs are both created and destroyed. They represent the collapse of a major and I would say uniquely important economic sector, on one hand for jobs, but not only or even primarily for jobs. The health of our manufacturing and broader industrial sector is critical to our national security. It's critical to ultimately technology and innovation, our ability to scale and create things at all. And I think you see in the fallout from the economic course that we have pursued a real decline in innovation, investment, productivity growth, and jobs, good jobs being one element of that, but certainly not the only element. So I think starting with that as the problem, it seems to me that that a tariff that says we actually have a preference for domestic production over imports is a very important conceptual starting point. I think your question about negotiating tactic versus sort of permanent policy is a very important one. And I think ultimately the answer is both. And the reason that the answer is both is that with respect to the Marmara moderator's prerogative, you can't actually put China to the side. If you only try to address the issue of China and say, other than that, we're good with free trade, what you will get is an awful lot of Chinese goods making their way in from Vietnam and ultimately even Mexico. I think the question of whether or not Mexico plans to allow for, say, BYD factories is an incredibly consequential one, but it frames the problem well. If Mexico is going to let BYD set up Chinese Communist Party subsidized car factories in Mexico, those cannot be eligible for USMCA treatment. And so the long run picture I think we are headed to is probably the return of trading blocs, in which there is a US-centric trading bloc that has free trade within it, but that the condition of that is that there are barriers between that bloc and a Chinese-centric bloc that is built on a very different model. How you get from here to there, I think, starts with an opening position of there is going to be a global tariff, and then countries with whom the U.S. can maintain balanced trade and a actually coherent free market are ones that ultimately then come within that circle. I think that's the direction we should hope to head. But I think the question of how do we get from here to there is a challenging one that is what policymakers are working through.
So just ask two follow-ups specifically, and then we'll bring others in. One is, do you think that it will get in the way of creating a U.S. trading bloc if we put tariffs on, say, Germany? Or are they also not going to be in the U.S. trading bloc? They'll be in some other trading bloc. Tariffs on Canada. How do you get to the U.S. trading bloc when you're doing all of that, especially when you're starting with a world where for most of the countries in the world, China is their primary trading partner, not the United States. We're starting out behind on trade. So the role of tariffs in that aspect of it.
We are not starting out behind, of course. Prior to embracing China entering the WTO, we were the primary trading partner.
I'm talking 2025.
Well, yeah. I'm tracing how we came to this place and whether or not we did a good job en route. Yes, I think that's an enormous challenge, and that is a question that countries are going to face, is which trading bloc would they prefer to be in? I think you are seeing that debate play out in real time in Europe, particularly on the EV issue, where there are some folks who are standing up and saying, wait a minute, what are we doing? We are literally handing control over our auto industry to the Chinese. We can't do that. And others, for a time, including the German auto manufacturers, saying, no, we should do that. We want to make more money in China for 5 more years before it all falls apart. I don't know which way Europe will go on that. I think it's fairly safe to assume that Canada and Mexico would certainly like to be in a U.S.-centric bloc. I think it's also safe to assume that China's other main adversaries or competitors like Japan and India would probably prefer to be in that bloc. But I also don't want to sort of wander out and somehow sort of predict the future of geopolitics for the next 20 years. That it is obviously an incredibly dynamic situation. And that's why I say the question is, how do you get from here to there? How do you actually get to a coherent global economy in which the U.S. is able to benefit from the benefits that trade can have, but in an actual balanced context and in a context where the free market values that we actually care about are ones that we're able to enjoy. Because that's the last thing I would emphasize is that I think, one of the foundational errors that we made was to somehow see free trade as an extension of free markets, that somehow if you are for free markets, then surely you are for free trade as well. And the reality is that free trade with China is the antithesis of free markets. It is merging our market into one dominated by an authoritarian communist party that has no respect for any of the free market principles that we want to uphold, and that leaves everybody acting in our market subject to decisions made there. And so I think, again, to refuse to leave China out of it, that has to be the starting point, to say that is simply not acceptable or tenable. And then if we agree that that's true, okay, then we can discuss, and there's great debate to be had about how exactly do you do something about it.
Right. I mean, again, I don't personally get how tariffs on India will help to India, but
well, I guess what I'm saying is that there is an either or. There is by default, if there are countries that are going to continue to pursue trade with China, they are going to be subject to tariffs from the United States. Conversely, countries that want to sign up for the U.S. Arrangement don't need to face those tariffs, but they need to make other commitments vis-a-vis China or that set of countries.
Literally, you just described the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Trump pulled us out of. That was basically eliminating tariffs for countries that were trading with each other, not with China. So do you think that pulling out of that was a mistake?
So I tended to be in favor of the TPP for exactly that reason. I think the problem with TPP is that while you're right, it did not include China, I don't think it had much in the way sort of oppositional to China. And that is a function of the sort of era in which it originated, which was one in which people were not yet taking seriously the idea of needing to decouple from China. I think you still even would hear people saying aspirational things about maybe China will join TPP someday. So I think you're exactly right that is a sort of, in some senses, conceptually desirable direction to head, but it can't be as just sort of, here's another free trade agreement that otherwise basically leaves, I guess, the defunct WTO as the status quo. It needs to be a piece of a broader strategy.
Kim, want to just hear from you, a little bit more what you think about what Oren said, but if you were at the Council of Economic Advisors doing what Rich said, and the president wants to know, maybe negotiating tactic, whatever it is, but in the interim, what are the impacts on the U.S. economy? Certainly that's something when I was at CEA and we did the first round of tariffs, the first round of sanctions on Russia in 2014, they wanted to know from us, what will the impact of these be on the U.S. economy? I thought they were a very small negative. People thought the foreign policy considerations vastly outweighed that small negative, moved ahead. I certainly agreed with that, but I wasn't trying to opine on the foreign policy. So what would you be saying about the economics? And in particular, why doesn't it help manufacturing? Why doesn't it rechannel to domestic production? I guess you can bring in China, even though I was trying to keep it out because Oren's ruined that. Oren's ruined that plan.
Let's start with this notion that tariffs favor domestic production over imports, right? And anyone can show that in a partial equilibrium. Let's say we have a tariff on steel, right? That will encourage U.S. steel production relative to imports of steel. That's true. However, that doesn't have a full general equilibrium perspective, or to put that in plain English, we're not done with the story, right? When steel becomes more expensive in the United States, that makes it harder to make cutlery in the United States. It makes it harder to make cars in the United States. It makes it harder to make anything that uses steel as an input, right? So it hurts our manufacturers that want to use steel in that direction. It also induces retaliation by trading partners. And this isn't a hypothetical. Like, we've actually done this exact thing where foreign countries then tariff our products, right? And we lose markets for the things that our exporters would sell abroad, right? It puts pressure on the exchange rate. Let's say we don't just tariff steel, we tariff a number of things. We do this across the board tariff, right? That's going to increase demand for the products that we're tariffing, right? But there's only so much the U.S. can make. And so the exchange rate will rise in response to that excess demand, which will again hurt our export sectors. What tariffs do is not increase domestic production, they reallocate domestic production towards things we do poorly and away from things we do well, right? And that's not really a recipe for economic success. Further, I think to the extent that they help the trade deficit, it would be by causing recessionary impact on the U.S. economy. We tend to have a smaller trade deficit when we're in recessions. If that's our only goal, that's the quickest way, right? Like, let's reduce the trade deficit by causing a recession. If we do the tariffs in a period that's not recessionary, if we somehow manage to avoid the recession, we're still not really confident this is going to help the trade deficit, right? The trade deficit is a macroeconomic phenomena that is the flip side of a savings investment imbalance. The biggest driver of the U.S. trade deficit is the fact that we refuse year after year after year to consume the same amount that we produce, right? Not just as private citizens, but the most large example of this is the U.S. federal government, that over the coming decade is forecast to have a deficit to GDP ratio that exceeds 6%, and it would be more like 8% if we extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions, right? So if you look at that government budget deficit, that is directly contributing to the trade deficit, because it's the U.S. federal government saying, listen, we don't want to pay for the things that we're buying, and that means that we have to then borrow abroad. Until that changes, we will have a trade deficit. And in fact, we saw in the first Trump administration, they made no progress on the overall U.S. trade balance because they didn't change those underlying macroeconomic fundamentals, right? And the quickest path to changing those fundamentals would be to rein in the budget deficit. And if you look at the series of Trump tax proposals, it goes in the opposite direction. One final thing I'll say is about the international relations impact of this. I think threatening every partner and ally in the world with tariffs, and even on the days immediately following the election, threatening Canada and Mexico for being Canada, right, and for Mexico, set of policy grievances, right, that's immediately alienating some of our closest allies and friends. The Trump administration doesn't have, a monopoly on this kind of behavior. I think it was very misguided for the Biden administration to not approve of the U.S. Steel acquisition by one of our closest friends and allies, Japan, and their company, right? So I think that if you want to counter China, if you take the Chinese threat seriously, and if you think there are actions there that you don't like, then you need to think in a more strategic fashion about A, will your action change Chinese behavior? But B, who are you going to work with in the rest of the world to counter this behavior? If you're busy alienating everybody in the world by threatening them with tariffs, I think it's going to be a pretty easy decision for the typical third nation, who shall remain nameless, sort of decide who they want to orient with. Is it somebody who's threatening them all the time, or is it somebody who's open to trade and international partnership?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So I appreciate you just...
It's not about China.
It's not about China. It's about general equilibrium models, because I think this is an important distinction. You have your partial equilibrium model. You have the general equilibrium model. Do you have a general equilibrium model that accounts for the effect of a shift back toward manufacturing on U.S. students majoring in engineering?
Yeah, I don't think that there would be a shift back towards manufacturing.
Well, I'm asking, is there a general equilibrium model that considers how the sorts of careers people pursue is affected?
There's certainly plenty of economic models that link educational attainment to underlying features of the economy. But I think the root spot where you and I might disagree is whether tariffs can be a useful lever toward the aim of driving up manufacturing employment. And there's probably a second thing that we disagree on, which is whether we should fetishize that itself, right? Like whether those jobs are uniquely special such that it's worth an enormous taxpayer sacrifice to get a few more manufacturing jobs, or whether that's something that might not be worth it.
Well, I think the question of the value of the manufacturing sector is certainly a disputed one, which is an important distinction. My concern is that economists describe as general equilibrium models things that are so far from general equilibrium that they should really be called like slightly less partial equilibrium models. And what we have seen in attempts by general equilibrium models to predict what is going to happen with trade policy is that they fail miserably. I'm not aware of a general equilibrium model, for instance, that predicted the China shock. Certainly, if there was one, the economists kept it very well hidden. And I'm not aware of one that can account for what has actually happened and the consequences of what happens when, for instance, we lose our leadership in semiconductor manufacturing. And what that then means when we don't have even the capability ultimately to do advanced semiconductor manufacturing and then have to launch a major government program to bring it back. Now, you could say that's okay, semiconductor manufacturing doesn't have any value, but my point is that that's the level that the debate is happening at. We're not having a debate about who does and doesn't understand general equilibrium models. We're having a debate about what actually needs to be taken into account. And we have for 25 years pursued a model of trade policy that says that this set of models that, among other things, takes all forms of GDP to be exactly equal and be exactly as beneficial, and that if we are, quote, worse at making semiconductors than we are at running massage parlors, we should just let the semiconductor manufacturing go away and have more people working in massage parlors, even though, to be clear, we were not worse at semiconductor manufacturing. We just didn't want to subsidize it as aggressively. And then we have all of the fallout from that. And then if somebody stands up and says, wow, that has not gone well at all, we need to do something different. If the answer is, well, the model that said that that's what we should do says we should continue doing it, it's just not actually responsive to the debate we need to have.
Why don't I say what?
Okay. Go ahead.
I'll say one thing about that, and then Rich, I want to bring you in. I think, Oren, the issue is, if we didn't have any government procurement policy, we would have no aircraft carriers. Like, the private sector just isn't going to go out and make aircraft carriers and start flying them around the world. We think not for our GDP, not for middle-class jobs, but for our national security, we want aircraft carriers. So the government appropriates money and it buys them, and then the private sector builds them. I think of the CHIPS program as the same thing. If you asked me to create good middle-class jobs, I would not give $10 billion to Intel. That just would be like not in my top 100. If you asked me to make microchips that are a little bit crappier than the ones that Taiwan makes, a little bit more expensive than the ones that Taiwan makes, but are made here in the United States where no one's going to invade and take them away from us, I'd say, yeah, why not? Let's pay an extra cost for those microchips. But we'd be frank that we had these two goals. One was basically jobs and GDP. And in some ways we're sacrificing on that goal in order to achieve this other goal, which is national security. I think where you differ is you think you're pursuing both goals simultaneously. And that's part of why I was trying to keep China out of it, was to understand, and again, I think the same has been true in the Biden administration, true in the Trump administration, how much is it you're creating great jobs and helping our national security versus you are paying a cost, but it's a cost that might or might not be worthwhile for our national security. But Rich, why don't we bring you in on whatever thoughts you have on any of this? And then I want to get to industrial policy, because we've gotten there already.
So at the CEA, different people had to specialize in different areas. And the most forlorn economists at the CEA specialized in trade. So I'm going to bring China in because this was a major issue in the second year of the Trump administration. And it's one that I think led to President Trump's administration, political people, realizing that there was some value to economists. So I will just say that had we at the CEA said, of course, trade is efficient trade leads to greater growth. So let's stop talking about this. We're not going to do this policy. That would have been the last meeting that we were at. Kevin Hassett asked people in our group, given that we are going to have tariffs on China, what is the best way to do that so that the pain that we suffer is minimized relative to the pain that China suffers? And for you economists out there, we didn't use the general equilibrium model. We used something very simple. If China dominated the production of this product in the world, we don't put tariffs on that. If China just puts is a much smaller share of the world market, we tariff China on that, and we have alternatives to purchase that good in other countries. It was like, wow, what a great idea. You economists really can do something. So the issue is, ultimately, the political people make the decisions here. And the question is, how much can we as economists reduce the costs of whatever it is they decide they want to do, or increase the benefits by doing it in a more a clever way in terms of dealing with markets? So, Oren, I'll just tell you that I've heard all of those arguments, and Peter Navarro, I think, made all of them to us. And I understand where you're coming from, and there are problems out there. But the idea of using a uniform tariff across all countries as a way of raising revenues might have made sense in 1790, but in a more specialized...
McKinley's day, he should have known better.
So I think that's I don't know more than that I can tell you. Economists are helpful in getting to do what you want to do to some degree.
And Rich, do you have any sense as to whether the president and economic policy making will be motivated by that view? Because certainly there's an awful lot of discussion that sounds as if tariffs are good in and of themselves, especially as a way to raise revenue in an efficient and fair manner, it's argued.
So this is how people at the CEA managed to do their jobs in the best possible way that we could do it. And that is not to try to provide economic justifications for the positions that the administration took in public, but rather to be a source of information to people who wanted to know what was actually going on in the economy, based on the kinds of policies that were being considered at the moment. And that really meant being careful to have a factual base for everything that you said. Mr. Trump is a spectacularly successful politician. Who would have believed that he would have gotten a second term? So I'm not a politician. I wouldn't tell President Trump what to say to get elected. My job is to, behind the scenes, say, here are the consequences that we see if you actually did what you were talking about. But the other thing that President Trump does, and he just does it to annoy people, is that even when he knows that there's an increase based on analysis that we give him that growth in employment will increase by 6 million people because of the tax credit. He'll say it's going to increase by 12 million. And then the debate is, it's not whether it's 6 million, it's how much is it? Is it 12 million or 6 million? That's what Trump does. He annoys people. I know you're annoyed by him, but I think he makes a sufficient number of good decisions that I voted for him. So sue me.
Okay. I'm not sure there'll be any lawsuits, but we'll see. We'll see. Let's go to industrial policy now. This administration has certainly rhetorically done a lot on industrial policy, potentially actually done a lot on it. Some things are, for example, restrictions of technology transfer to China in the microchip domain, and that will certainly continue in this administration. I think we can all agree. But the other things have been subsidizing production in the United States. There's been, I've heard, much more hostility to that. So I'm curious, what direction do we think that aspect of industrial policy will take over the next couple of years, and what direction, ought it to take over the next couple of years? And we'll begin with you, Oren, and just go straight down the line.
Yeah, sure. And I think, as you noted, it sort of segues nicely from where we ended up in the trade policy discussion, because what industrial policy comes down to, and it's very closely tied to trade policy, is does what you make matters. Does what you make matter? This would be a difficult one to conjugate. The sort of seminal quote for testing tuitions on this is CA Chair Michael Boskin's famous line, "Computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference?" And I think whether or not you agree with that or not essentially dictates most of where you're then going to come down on both the trade discussion we were just having and the industrial policy discussion. And so I'm actually very curious, if I could just very quickly, I'm curious of people in the room, how many of you think that's good economic thinking? Computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? Couple of hands. Someone in the back, thank you. So,
Mark in the front.
And Mark in the front. So computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? Was, I would say, quite mainstream accepted wisdom that, again, it's just GDP. My understanding is certainly that any general equilibrium model would endorse computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? And for that matter, eating a bag of chips at the movies, computer chips, what's the difference? That whatever it is that we end up counting as GDP is equally useful and valuable in the moment and is equally likely to place us on a good economic trajectory going forward. If, on the other hand, you look at something like the computer chips and say, no, computer chips actually really matter in a way that potato chips don't, to and even putting aside the national security argument, that in purely economic terms, they have a very different implication for the path our economy is likely to take, the types of investments we're likely to see, the types of skills we are likely to develop, ultimately how much innovation and growth we are going to get, then you have a real problem, because capital markets certainly don't care. For capital markets, it is absolutely the case. Computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? And so what you see on industrial policy in theory and now in practice is recognizing that if there are certain things that we really care about and see as more valuable than the market will price in, especially in a world where other countries absolutely believe that to be the case and are aggressively working to win leadership in those areas at our expense, then we are going to have to do something. And so I think, chips is kind of the start of that. I think there's obviously a lot of focus on critical minerals as another area, which again has national security implications, but equally is upstream of batteries and a lot of what you might want to do in the energy space. And so I think what you see with the administration is the sort of collision of two impulses. On one hand, a view that we obviously have real problems here that we want to address. On the other hand, a general sort of skepticism of subsidies and having government kind of come in and say, we need to create a policy for this industry, because that's undoubtedly where the political economy gets a lot shakier. And so what I think you'll see is, you've already seen quite robust support for chips specifically. I think certainly any IRA money that's already out the door funding active projects is likely to persist. But then going forward, I think you'll see a lot of active policy efforts in the space, but whereas in the last administration it was overwhelmingly focused on climate and green issues, it will now become overwhelmingly focused on the sort of prerequisite industrial inputs, whether that's natural resources and energy, whether that's sort of what get identified as most strategic supply chain nodes, in essentially supplementing the trade side of the strategy.
Kim.
So I think with industrial policy and really with the trade conversation, it's useful to distinguish the sort of across the board policy instrument from the targeted one, right? I think my strong view is that the across the board tariffs, as an example, would actually on net harm manufacturing, employment, and the U.S. economy. Whereas you might make a very reasonable argument for not having free trade with Russia and weapons parts, right? As an example, right? National security dictates that certain things we should have control over ourselves, right? And that we should be cautious about vulnerabilities and supply chain disruption in things that directly affect national security. And there may be some other goods that we think are particularly important, and I think economics is well suited to understanding those types of goods. Are there positive externalities associated with them? A vaccine would be an example, right? We think that the market left to its own devices with absolutely no government intervention would probably have responded insufficiently to the COVID pandemic, but with advanced purchase agreements and various other things that were put in place, helpfully by the Trump administration, vaccine development was quicker, and that was a benefit to eventually the entire world, but in the short term to the United States and other countries that could afford them at the start, right? So I think economics is well suited to sort of distinguish between these general cases and these more narrow cases.
All right, and that ends part one. Sorry to cut it somewhat abruptly, but that's what you get when you take a 2-hour session and just split it in half. Just imagine a dramatic to be continued flashing on the screen, hopefully a little bit of a cliffhanger for you. But obviously focus there was trade and industrial policy. And in part two, coming up on Monday, we will dive into immigration as well as fiscal policy. So hope you enjoyed this conversation and look forward to the next one coming up soon. In the meantime, enjoy the weekend.